Let's pray. Lord, we ask for your blessings on this time of moving through your word and to understand the layout of this vision that Daniel has been able to assess because of your spirit and to interpret in the same manner. And actually what the compression of this man's life and his brothers in the faith means to us. We as well are realizing that there's a connection that you're endeavoring to make with Nebuchadnezzar, which is important for us to see with regard to the Gentile world, and that we're not to dismiss the fact that though we may not be able to believe it or see it, even have evidence that suggests we could deny that another or others could be welcomed into your kingdom. This is very reflective of the fact that you are an evangelistic God. And no life that you have breathed your spirit into is to be dismissed from what was your intent, and that's to reveal yourself to them. So help us even now to assimilate this and be encouraged by it. We thank you, praying in Jesus' name. Amen. We've gone over some statistics that I still believe are important for you to grasp, even though it seems perhaps unbelievable in terms of, when we look back at what Jerusalem would have been under Solomon's rule, and that probably we can say through the tenure of Zedekiah it had remained in its integrity as a worship center, a growing populace, but ultimately under judgment, which is where Daniel's at right now. And that we looked at what was that configuration, several hundred acres of land that God was sovereignly overseeing, and that ultimately would give the eviction notice over, and what the walls may have looked like, and that compared to Babylon, seemingly inferior, except for one of the most important factors: God was in that place. It could have been a tent. It could have been trees that surrounded the city and not walls. It could have been any one of those things, and as long as God was in that place, they did not have to worry. Isn't that pretty, in my opinion, exciting when you think about what God did for them in the wilderness when they had no fortress at all? They had the tabernacle, a 70 by 100 foot rectangle with the presence of God evident, and it was enough to keep at bay those who would attack. Pretty significant. So at any rate, in driving through Tel Aviv and Jaffa yesterday, I was just doing this mental calculation. How could it be that Babylon, cited by a Greek historian, and maybe some differences of opinion and disputes of how different people said no way, or how could it be, but the average height of what would be considered your skyscrapers in that city was 32 floors. So if you average that with what considers mathematically a floor at 10 feet, 9 to 10 feet, it's about a 320 foot high building. And I was saying that was the presumption of the walls of Babylon. And therefore, could technology have existed to take something such as a wall of that height? Well, we have technology that permits us to do that with buildings. And the 32 floor skyscrapers right now are considered low-grade height compared to the averages, which right now rise at 52 and 100. That's huge. But all I'm saying is that in the ingenuity of men back then, and with what God had told us in Genesis chapter 11, it was possible. But the premise I'm also making is that remember that Nebuchadnezzar had been at war with Egypt. So he was privy to the grandeur of what Egypt had done since it had been sacked in the time of Moses. And it had been just pillaged and brought low. It probably crumbled to some degree and moved into a state of decay because they wouldn't have had the resources with what God allowed Israel to pull from the economy would have taken hundreds of years to rebuild. But the point that I'm making on this, at this time, Nebuchadnezzar would have entered in and attacked Egypt. More of a military campaign to defeat the military against a stronger military. And that being said, is that he would have been impressed with the things that Egypt would have visually offered him to see. Armies that he vanquished, but a city that he seemed to have left after the army was taken care of. He probably received from Egypt tribute. Really, that's kind of the way it worked. Their economies were pumped up by taking governance over societies and saying, you owe the king on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis taxation, this amount. If you don't give it, you'll see us back at your front door and we're taking your little doggy too. And that's kind of the way that it would have worked. Anybody knows that that's enough to pull extra coins out of your pockets, just threaten to take your little doggy. And so, that being said, is that the pyramids that would have been there and able to be very impressive, those were about what are called the Great Pyramids of Egypt. They averaged about 350 feet from base to tip. What was the wall that I gave to you in the facts for Babylon? About 350, 330 feet, something like that. So it is possible that both generationally and by empires, these guys had it dialed in and had to make something big. I now take that and say that on the other end of this, and really this very short tenure that Nebuchadnezzar would have had, we talked about the ziggurat, right? In chapter 11 of Genesis, it was that spiral building that was the invention of man to connect with God and study the stars. They really weren't interested in God, Jehovah, they were interested in gods, spectacular stars and planets and so forth. But the ziggurat is assumed based on details that were left archaeologically as well to be at about 350 or 375 feet from base to height. So what I'm saying is that that would have been equivalent to the walls that were built. It would have been a huge, massive building. Again, skyscraper 32, stories high. This was massive architecture and technology. So I wanted to simply address that, saying by logic, you don't have to presume it was impossible. It was possible. They were doing it. And God would also be saying that within the context of both societies, it's just for a season that you have boasting points in this, because I am going to take you down. When we looked at the statue that now is going to come back into play in chapter 3, God was simply setting up for Daniel the scope and sequence of basically the timeline of humanity before God would come in his final punctuation of sovereignty and establish himself as ruler over all. So that's when the dream was taking these particular precious metals and then at the same time having within the context of that vision PowerPoints of the empires. Oh, wow. Okay, so not as precious a metal, meaning not in terms of the perspective of man as significant, or perhaps even as accomplished, but the power with which these empires would yield, their strength. So, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian Empire. Before them, the Assyrians were vanquished. Nebuchadnezzar's father saw to that. Nebuchadnezzar, then you had the Medes and the Persians, that's coming up within the next chapter or so. And then you had, after that, the Greeks and then the Romans. And what is now left to be satisfied is this future empire that will ultimately be that which the stone rolls over and all empires just reduced to rubble. And we're not there yet because that ultimately will happen in the satisfaction of the millennial kingdom. So just for that as review. But I've entitled this today in chapter 3 is, and I want to make sure I'm right on this one. I'm trying to be clever with it, but I've entitled it that Life's a Vapor and Faith's a Fire. So you can put that down for chapter 3. Life's a vapor, faith's a fire. And with that, I'm going to direct your attention to the book of James, and you are familiar with it. And in the book of James, chapter 4, picking it up at verse 13, come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Verse 14, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Closing off there. Very pertinent. You can see this word not only having relevance to Daniel, who had to live in the parameters right now of his exile, saying there's nothing more that I can do about where I'm at, but there is something that I can do while I'm there. To make your life count. To make it count even though the scriptures have clearly said our days will be numbered. We have numbered days. Phone beeped this morning on Christie's cell. And so as the alarm buzzed and the beep happened, I picked it up and put on my glasses. And she had received a notice from my sister-in-law that my brother, who's 2 years my senior, was taken into the hospital. I can't ever get the time right. I have no idea where we're at. But I suppose it would have been there. I don't know where we're at. Thursday or Friday. We're on the Friday, Thursday. With what she was, I think, describing as simply a massive seizure. So what you don't know, though, is that my brother was a periodontist. So about 2.5 years my senior. And he was one that, in high school, the best counsel that was given to him by several teachers was, hey, Jim, why don't you join the Army and get shot? That might be the best choice for you. Meaning that he had really a pathetic evaluation of what his life could be. And that was the best they could offer him. I never saw Jim that way, ever. But at any rate, to sum it up, in an area that I think is important for you to realize, he went on to become a dental hygienist. He then went on to become the possessor of a general dentistry doctor's degree. And he went on then to specialize in periodontia. So he spent probably 15 years of his life in the school to become a professional oral surgeon. So in our last year at the mission, thereabouts, some had voiced a concern about Jim's, he was finding himself getting lost. I didn't see it. I think Christy saw it, but his wife was seeing it. At any rate, when that season passed and they came back up from this, we were there to see my twin brother basically retire. Tests confirmed that he was in the beginning stages of the onset of early Alzheimer's. So my brother now, who earned that degree and had a very prolific, very successful dentistry business in Portland, is one that needs to be diapered now. and his mind is not where it needs to be. So this has been within 10 years. So in this study, it hit me. I'm just going, oh my goodness. And there's nothing I can do about it. It could have been that, hey, Rich just letting me know, Christy letting me know, Jim passed away this morning. That's the inevitable right now. That is my reality, is that one who in my life, very special brother, is on the last stages of his life. But it doesn't mean that I couldn't precede him. It takes just one event, one moment that I didn't count on, didn't factor. And any one of us could precede someone else seemingly on their last. The reason that I'm emphasizing that with just a personal kind of story for you is that life hits hard, and it has hurts that are hard at the same time to deal with. But I can't get on a plane and leave what I'm doing, right? I can't just stop. That's not my tomorrow. My tomorrow is today, to satisfy what I've come to do. And so that being said, is that when you're looking at this, and when I also told you in the advent of coming back to chapter 3, 16 to 17 years have passed. And the question was, well, how do you know these things? Because you base it on the timeline of the birth and ultimately the accomplishments of civilizations. You can basically anchor it based on the beginning of a man's life and his termination. And that's the way that we look at things. So all of a sudden in chapter 3, we're taking these guys who in our minds are still, 15, 16, 17, 18. Okay, yeah, like me. I got it. I can feel it. I'm there. Well, you're not there, because these guys have now preceded you by about 16 to 17 years. They're in their 30s. What else of information do you need to know? The distance and close proximity between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is much closer than perhaps you presumed. Maybe I didn't even share it. But about 13 years. I can totally relate to that, because I'm a baby boomer, so when my parents began having children, 2 of them were early in their marriage. And my dad was at war. Well, he was pretty much at war most of my life. World War II, Korean War, Vietnam. So then Robert and I, the last 2, we came packaged as twins, but we came 13 years later. So when my dad fathered me, my mom was 38, my dad was 41 when ultimately Robert and I came, screaming out of the womb. Actually, we weren't screaming because we were preemies, so we were actually plucked chickens ready for the incubator. That's how they developed rotisserie chicken. They tested light bulbs out of that. So, Richie's standing up nicely, but he's too scrawny. Send Rob home. So, but that being said, is that I understand this difference between 13 years seniority over us. Now, okay, so let me put that into other practical reality for you. This could be the minimum age difference of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, just 13 years. So Christy and I are separated by 13 years. So Nebuchadnezzar, Danielle, 13 years. That's the difference right now that you're looking at. And so that being said, is that now the Lord's just compressing things just intensely. Because when we're through with chapter 3 and we move on into the next vision, you're going to see a whole nother aging thing that's happening. You're going, what? How could this be? We want to smell his teenage years, and we want to grasp what he was doing, what they were at. But you're not. We're getting moved into his 30s, and the next season you're going to see his 50s. All of these guys. James tells us our life's a vapor. The phone call that I got, or the text that Christy received, it tells me our life is a vapor. I have to prepare myself for the possibility of another funeral. I've presided over my father's, my mother's, a nephew, born, I think, just slightly prematurely, but without a skull. And talk about a niece who was able to say, with regard to this scripture, oh, but though that was a vapor for my son, what an extraordinary life he lived in the womb. And they had 6 hours with him, is that right? To be nursed and coddled with a beautiful little cap for his head that had a skull. And he was a beautiful baby. 6 hours to be held by his mom. So this right now, if I had to just say, where's the emphasis then going on this? Life's a vapor, faith's a fire. What do you mean the fire? I'd like you to turn to 1 Peter. These are all anchor points now because the text is going to go rather fast. Chapter 4. We're going to pick it up in verse 12. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Again, the emphasis, don't think it's strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you. There's a fiery trial that is kindled, that is purposed by God to try us, to refine us, to prove us, to perfect us, to, if you would, burn up the dross. For what? Not the gold of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, but the gold that God has literally covered us in. A divine gold covering that he's covered us in. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part, he is blasphemed, but on your part, he is glorified. Meaning that when that happens, a world is saying, curse you, God. While God looks at you and says, blessed are you. But I just think this is really cool and apropos to what the Lord is saying to us through the life of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The personal notations that I've given to you, that we will suffer. And that's why even in the question when it first opened up concerning, how was the camping trip? I really did indulge to say, awesome. Though I could explain to you the suffering, it's going to become one of my favorite remembrances because Jesus had it hard. And he reminded me, even in such a beautiful setting, that he spared himself no hardship for our sake and for salvation. And so it says, yet if anyone suffers as Christians, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, there or where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? And that's what I think is so significant about how this is a preamble to both the godly who are going to be put in the fire and the Gentile king who says the fire will be kindled and it's going to be hot and I'm going to burn you for your faith. If you will not yield to me, then you will yield to the fire. That's in essence the drama. Life's a vapor, faith's a fire. What does God desire? Nebuchadnezzar the king, verse 1, chapter 3, he's made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so here are your next facts and figures. I'm sure you've studied it. So this is 90 feet high by 9 feet in width. If you studied Da Vinci's artwork, it seems to be by ratio just a little bit off. And I think that that is something that God would say. It was a little bit off. The other thing that you need to see just in this opening on that detail alone is that it's Nebuchadnezzar endeavoring to take the information that Daniel had provided to him from God and switch things. He had time to consider, the ancient beauty of Egypt that now pays taxes to me. Babylon, whom I have inherited from my father, and I am making splendid and glorious. Yes, this is an exciting work that I now will do. Because though I heard that that represented empires to come after me, I'm going to thwart that. I have power and authority to do it, so I'm changing things as my marker. And that's really what you need to see. It's Nebuchadnezzar who is right now being exalted in pride, and he's going to make an image reflective of his heart to say, I will not yield. Proverbs 16 verse 5 says, the Lord detests the proud. They will surely be punished. I think that's a great verse to anchor yourself in, both in James and 1 Peter that we've taken a look at for our own personal application, which is what that was presented for. But this is Nebuchadnezzar's personal application. He hates your pride, Nebuchadnezzar. He's reaching down to you through godly men who can inspire you. You sit on a throne that's above them, but they are established in their faith strongly. They can connect with you eye to eye and heart to heart. They're speaking the language of God to your compulsive behavior to glorify yourself through this beautiful kingdom. So I like what Proverbs 16:5 says. They will surely be punished. Well, how's the punishment happening? It's not yet. It's going to come. Meaning that sometimes one of our problems is to say, but I want it now. I mean, that's what they're deserving of. God's patient. We need to understand that God's patient. I heard you heard a testimony from Steve today. God was patient with him. God was patient with me. He did not have a believing relationship, as he told me, at the age that I certainly did, years before him. I would say probably 20 years before him. But the difference between us is what I did not do with the knowledge that I have, what he chose to do quickly with the knowledge that he received. We were totally two different characters in the same timeline as contemporaries. We're contemporaries. And I was the one that had been dragging my feet. He was the one that simply was allowing his feet to take him anywhere that he wanted to go, anywhere that was his heart's desire. The waves and the pleasures of the world. I was just distracted by life and successful as a teacher. But the predicament still stood. What are you going to do with your life, gentlemen? And it is interesting that at about approximately the same time, we got our acts together, which is ACTS. But in the very next chapter, we're going to see AXE, the axe, come to the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. 90 high, that's 9 stories. If you're in a 9-story building, you are going to go, wow, that's tall, don't want to fall from there. And so it's set up in the plains of Dura. So what else do you want to know? I'll tell you. This is about 12 to 8 miles from the epicenter of paganism, rampant, overt sin, all secularly and governmentally endorsed and very likely managed quite well to be not necessarily so offensive to everybody. You can join in whenever you want. You can be a part of this and you can pull back from this. But the 8 to 12 miles needs to, I think, share, a little bit of a reason to it. And that would be if he is insisting that the populace participate. He's not going to be able to host a shindig in Babylon with already the icon of their pagan religion being anchored in the ziggurat. What would he be doing? He would be immediately creating a conflict of interest between what his pagan deities required and the central worship of themselves and him. He's testing right now, theoretically, what would it be if I just have my thing just a little bit further, but I'm going to impose in that a law that says you violate worshiping that statue, you're not going to live to regret it. There'll be nothing you can do. You're judged. That hasn't yet been made as an injunction. But the 12 miles to 8, whatever that is, think about what that would be like. Oh, brother, the orchestra's warming up again. They are? Yeah.
Didn't we just go yesterday to a concert?
Uh-huh.
12 miles?
Uh-huh.
I don't want to go.
If you don't go, you're going to be routed out and torched. Okay, I'll go. Can I share your horse? I don't have one. I lost him on the last 12-mile outing. He died. So this would have been the only way in which an entire city of a populace of, we said something like 200,000, could have made that pilgrimage. 12 miles in radius from the epicenter of pagan worship could have been a big rock concert. The statue's surrounded by an orchestra, which we'll see, and the invitation and mandate, you're going to come. But I will guarantee if I said, guys, we're going on a 12-mile hike today, wear whatever you want, anticipate whatever you will, but we're going. And you might say, what's at the end of the journey? There's a piccolo player at the end of the journey. It's concert. It's pretty awesome. Don't you think you'll be a little tired to do anything about it? Doesn't matter, we're going. You'd probably challenge me on that being a reward. So even right now, what's being suggested is that he's totally into himself. And he's going to make sure that there is no opportunity of conflict with the central pagan religion that he has also authority over, and the fact that he wants to sample. I wonder if maybe at 90 feet I can restructure things and be found to have as much popularity as the ziggurat does for the community. And that's people worship. That's what happens with people. That's what happens with empires. Empires are always impressed. I wonder what I can do to make myself a little bit more meaningful, relevant. Politics, clear example. The reason we moved from points of the Constitution, the reason that we have challenges in staying lawful, is because we're always looking at the next thing that's going to bring us up in popularity to the will and the mind and the heart of the people whose what? Hearts are corrupt, and guess what they will do? They will take you in the direction of corruption. It's the base of humanity. The king Nebuchadnezzar set word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all of the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So knowing what it is you know right now and the details right now, and the fact that there are 16 years that can be calculated based on his birth and where he's at right now in his time, to manufacture something like that, that could have been a project that could have taken that long. Solomon took 13 years to build the house of the Lord. That was huge. He had a lot of resources. So it's very possible that it would have taken this long for that project. Everybody right now, though, is going to participate in the dedication of the image. And so the satraps, verse 3, the administrators, the governors, counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they probably wanted to say, can we just sit down, please? They stood up. So what you're also seeing right now is this is forced religion. The other was seductive religion. Oh, the ziggurat, connect with God. Be one with the universe. Look at the stars. Smell the hanging gardens of Babylon. It's so awesome. You will stand, you will walk, and you will bow down. Forced religion. Seductive religion, forced religion. It exists in every society. It exists in our world system. Both are dangerous. But one says something to the heart. I can't do this any longer. In the sense of a lawful requirement that I will die if I don't submit. Because of why? Because the Lord's put in our hearts eternity, and He's granted us free will. When our free will is taken, we will show spiritual resistance. This is why, as this moves on, 3 guys will choose to spiritually resist it, because they will say, I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and strength. I have endeavored to live in the principles of caring and loving my neighbor even as I do myself. I will not yield my free will that is given to God to bow down to a godless figurine. Whether it's gold or platinum, whatever it is, I will not do so. And so the herald cried aloud in verse 4, and it says, to you it's commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre in symphony with all the kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, verse 8, certain Chaldeans came and accused the Jews. Okay, this is an important point right now being made. We know that the characters are going to be identified specifically. But notice what is being emphasized, the Jews. Therefore, it's important to realize that there's going to be a time in the history of the Jewish nation in which the world system will say, bow down to us. And they will say, no way, not going to do it. We know that that's the time yet not fully identified in the image of the dream that was given to Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel interpreted. When you get down to the toes, when you get down to the fact that it's a picture ultimately of a kingdom that precedes the millennial kingdom, which is the time in which the rapture has taken place and the tribulation begins, there will be a government that says you will bow down to an image. This image will be known as Antichrist. He will insist upon a mark of all nations, all peoples, all languages. And what you will not have in that time is the representation of the church, because the church will have been taken out. While the church remains, the Spirit of God cannot be subordinated to any figure who projects himself larger on the scene than God has permitted. So one of the reasons we don't see Daniel right now is he's a picture in this case of what very likely the church is to be seen as. Having great authority, great influence, but no longer on the scene. To become, if you would, influential any longer. It's going to be another work by the Spirit while the church is out. So these guys are commanded to fall on their face, and if they do not, there's going to be a fire. And so with that, and in verse 8, and accused the Jews. So that's the important part right now, is that the world system will come against the national and spiritual interests of the Jews. And they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due respect to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke in verse 14, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Stall there. You mean, Nebi, it's coming to your attention right now that these guys don't serve your gods? Of course they didn't serve the gods of Babylon. Of course they weren't in alignment with Nebuchadnezzar's heart. And so what I'm saying is, and what this suggests, is that he would have been aware of it, but the difference is the fact that they are not honoring him and what this was representing. He was letting the national symbol of pagan worship be not so offensive to him. In fact, there were allowances with regard to what those people could and couldn't do. There were some allowances that were made. The Medo-Persian Empire actually will grant much greater liberty with that regard. But he was saying, not so much offended, but now that I've got something actually that represents my heart and who I am, man, my blood is boiling and your flesh is going to be burning. And doesn't that go to show you that a friendship with the world can never be accommodated when it ultimately wants to subordinate you from the things that God has asked of you and which you cannot do? That's when your friendship's terminated. One of the things that we see in our politics today is such anger and derision because there is in this administration an overt pointing to the Lord and an overt act of declaring Israel is the Jewish nation and their land is their land. Every president up to that point that we historically have known, at least since Truman, has been very docile, very permitting of other people to have a say-so in God's plan for Israel. Our current president made a strategic move that every single president before him was afraid to make, moving the U.S. Embassy into Jerusalem, basically planting a flag saying, "We're with you, Israel, this is your city." Before Tel Aviv, "Oh, it's comfortable, it's just a distance away." No problem. The U.S. is with you. We are with you. But we're over there. Got to keep things just light. Not ruffle feathers. Not create a tension zone. And Trump said, tension zone, let's do it, moving. And he actually did it on the anniversary, the 72nd anniversary of the Jewish nation. You know that the threat was, you do this, there's going to be fire, a rage, World War III. There wasn't. So I'm just going to say to you, we are in a time in which you as young voters, as believers, you can make a stand specifically for God and to rally around those who in governance, maybe not perfect in personality, but are any of us, and say, that guy speaks the Lord's heart. There's other stuff that he speaks, but one thing that he does speak is the Lord's heart for God's people in God's land. We're standing up to that statue that is exalting itself above the Jews and wanting them to bow down. We're standing against that. And so that's one of the things that we can see here pictured on a practical level. I think it's very important. So he's in a rage in verse 13. He brings the men in. Nebuchadnezzar speaks, just asks, is it true? Are you not going to worship my gods or worship the gold image, which is actually what he was more ticked off about? If you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? He'll find out. It's the same God that's reaching out to him through these guys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. I just love the voicing of it. So simple. We have no need to answer you in this matter. Just, If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. I mean, they would have been aware of it. Where was this furnace set up, for Pete's sake? My thoughts are is it would have been probably set up right in that plain of Dura so that the execution could have an immediate effect on the people. They wouldn't have to wonder, so do we have to go to execution today in Babylon? No, it's actually right here. The barbecue's happening right here. Worship or be consumed in fire. That was the idea. The Antichrist will impose the same thing. Get marked or be killed. Ooh, really? Really. Get marked or get killed. And people will make a decision. And the decision that they will have to make, who are left behind, is simply this. If that's the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And point to me, will there be people left behind all this and become believers? Absolutely, because the absence of those whom they love, whose testimony they bear still in their hearts, letters, Bibles left behind, because we won't need to take those with us, will testify. You have a decision to make. I made mine in advance, I'm gone. You remain. But the decision you make right now to whether or not you'll join me is based on whether you'll deny bowing down to that idol, bowing down now to that government that's exalting itself above you, bowing down to the insistence that you receive a mark if you want to live. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Let's go ahead and put on pause this teaching. We'll take a break.